The year is 1861. The American Civil War rages on. Holy smokes, look at them. They're absolutely destroying themselves over there. We don't have time to focus on that right now. We have all these bills to pay from the money that we owe France, Spain, and the UK. Oh man, these interest rates are pretty criminal. No, we don't. None of that matters. We spent all their money on our own civil war, so I need you to brainstorm how we're going to pay them back. What if we don't pay them back? Our tale begins in the country of Mexico. In 1861, the United States is engulfed in a civil war, and coincidentally, Mexico had just gotten out of a civil war of their own the same year. A bloody civil war between the liberals and the conservatives. Classic. The leader of the liberals, Benito Juarez, upon taking back his seat as the president of Mexico, inherited a nation nearing financial collapse. In an act of desperation, Juarez's government decided to temporarily cease all debt payments until they could sort things out. Across the Atlantic, Mexico's decision to halt payments obviously didn't sit too well with the debt collectors, France, Great Britain, and Spain. So, Great Britain organized a plan to seize and occupy the port of Veracruz, requesting that Spain and France send their fleets to occupy the port of Veracruz until payments could resume. On December 14, 1861, the first Spanish ships arrived at the port city of Veracruz. Veracruz had become a shadow of its former self after years of internal and international conflict. Even the mighty fortress, San Juan de Ulua, had been relegated to a prison. Veracruz surrendered and was occupied without resistance. The British and French would arrive shortly after. The intent for the three nations was to simply occupy the port until they could negotiate for payments to resume. However, unbeknownst to everyone else, France had ideas of their own. During this time, France was ruled by Napoleon III, a nephew to the Napoleon Bonaparte. And just like his uncle, Napoleon III held great ambitions for France. He aimed to expand France's sphere of influence around the world. Just one problem standing in between France's colonial ambitions in North America, though: the Monroe Doctrine. A declaration by the United States in which that they would oppose any further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. An attempt to establish a colony in North America would essentially mean war with the United States. However, with the United States now embroiled in a civil war, Napoleon III had the perfect opportunity to begin his plans to establish a French colony in the North American continent. In addition, Mexico, coming out of a civil war of their own, had a divide in the country that France could exploit. The conservatives, just having lost to Benito Juarez and the liberals, would likely support the invasion, further legitimizing the colonization of Mexico. France's plan? Take over Mexico, install a puppet government with the aid of the Conservative Party in Mexico, and to lead this puppet government, Napoleon would also need a leader whom the people of Mexico would readily accept. Somebody who understood the people, someone preferably with a connection to Mexico. His cousin, the Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria. Nothing good ever comes out of an Archduke Ferdinand being involved in anything. France, to the surprise of everybody, gradually began amassing their forces as large numbers of French troops began arriving at Veracruz. Realizing that France was mobilizing for a full-scale invasion of the country, Great Britain and Spain opted instead to negotiate a deal with Mexico and began withdrawing their troops from the country. On the 16th of April, 1862, the French made a proclamation to the citizens of Mexico stating that they were here to liberate the people. Diplomacy was all but over, as both sides geared up for armed conflict. The Mexican army, after a series of small skirmishes, set up a defensive position in the city of Puebla. The city of Puebla was protected by two fortresses, Fort Laredo and Fort Guadalupe. The two forts were located on a hill, with a trench connecting them together. The French army, nearly 7,000 strong, arrived at Puebla on the 4th of May, and the French army decided that they would try and take the forts head on. The battle began on the 5th of May, or Cinco de Mayo in Spanish. The man in charge of the defense of Puebla was named Ignacio Zaragoza. Also by his side was a relatively unknown young general at the time, Porfirio Diaz. Zaragoza, despite his men being outnumbered by nearly 2,000 men, was determined to make the French pay for every inch of Mexican soil. The French began the attack with an initial bombardment of the forts, which was then followed by a head-on charge by 2 columns of the Zouave battalions. The Zouaves marched uphill towards Fort Guadalupe, straight onto the Mexican fire. Upon reaching the fortress, the Zouaves needed to raise ladders in order to climb the walls to even gain entry into the fort. However, the Mexican defenders put up a ferocious resistance, even driving the defenders back at bayonet point. 3 times the Zouaves tried to take Fort Guadalupe and Loreto, and 3 times they failed. On the 3rd wave, the advancing French columns, in a state of disarray, attempted to reroute to Fort Loreto. In the process, the invading force found themselves trapped in between the 2 forts, as well as being in the direct line of fire from the trenches. Seeing the French lines scattered, Zaragoza ordered the cavalry to converge from both sides, with Porfirio Diaz leading one of the cavalry charges himself, sending the French running. The Battle of Puebla was a catastrophic failure for the French army, and nothing short of an epic victory for the Mexicans. Much to the frustration of Napoleon III, the Battle of Puebla would keep the French army from advancing any further into Mexico for the remainder of the year. However, despite the setback at Puebla, Napoleon III didn't give up on his ambitions to conquer Mexico. On February of 1863, 30,000 fresh troops arrived at the port of Veracruz, and fighting resumed across central eastern Mexico. March 16th, the French army once again arrived at Puebla, but this time around, instead of a head-on attack, they would lay siege to the city. Zaragoza had died of typhoid fever shortly after successfully defending Puebla. In the small town of Camarón de Tejeda, a patrol of the French Foreign Legion, numbering 60 men, held off 3,300 Mexican troops for 10 hours, until eventually running out of ammunition and having to surrender. Incidentally, this battle serves as an important day to the French Foreign Legion till the present day. Back in Puebla, after a 2-month siege and a series of failed relief attempts, Puebla fell to the French. The French soldiers entered the capital, Mexico City, next month, and continued to make staggering gains in the country throughout the year, controlling much of central Mexico. However, in the south of Mexico, the Mexican armies held. The Battle of Chiapa de Corzo saw the Mexican forces, outnumbered 3-1, successfully defend the state of Chiapa, preventing any further French advances south, with many women and children helping carry supplies during the battle. Although the Juarez government and the people of Mexico had yet to surrender, emboldened by these sweeping victories in central Mexico, the Archduke of Austria, Maximilian, was crowned the Emperor of Mexico in the summer of 1864. However, despite the coronation of Maximilian and the declaration of the Mexican Empire, fighting continued throughout Mexico. Throughout 1864, the now imperial forces of Mexico, under the command of Emperor Maximilian, continued to make advance after advance. The combined imperial and French forces now controlled the majority of the northern territory in addition to central Mexico. Benito Juarez, leading his government in exile, would move from city to city, all the while evading capture, even being pushed all the way back to the border of the United States. Even with their backs turned against the wall, Benito Juarez and the people of Mexico refused to quit. But their luck would eventually turn. In April of 1865, the American Civil War came to an end. France and Maximilian's imperial army had failed to subdue the country before the end of the American Civil War. The United States of America was able to supply Benito Juarez's army with much-needed supplies and equipment. In addition, American volunteers began arriving to aid Mexico in their fight to take back their country. While the Imperial Army may have made staggering gains, their progress was still largely propped up by France. By 1866, combined with pressure from the United States and the mounting costs of the campaign, Napoleon III realized that France's campaign to colonize Mexico became untenable, and announced that France would start to withdraw their forces from Mexico starting March of that same year. The imperial forces started to feel the ramifications of French troop withdrawal almost immediately. As the French started to withdraw their troops, Juarez's army began to take back the northern cities. In the south, the Mexican army also continued to keep the south from falling into the French hands. Particularly, General Porfirio Diaz, at this point having led his armies, being captured and escaping, had raised a new army and was pushing the French and the imperial forces out of the south and creeping towards the center. And along with it, the path to Puebla and Mexico City lay wide open, cementing Porfirio Diaz as a hero. 1867 saw the complete withdrawal of the French forces, and the imperial lines collapsed throughout Mexico. The commanding headquarters of the imperial forces were eventually trapped by the Mexican army in the city of Querétaro, and after 2 months, Maximilian and the imperialists were captured. In the summer, Benito Juárez would order the execution of Emperor Maximilian and his co-conspirators. After 5.5 years of undetermined resistance, Mexico emerged victorious, taking back their nation. Despite the restoration of the Mexican Republic, Mexico continued to experience internal conflicts following the end of the war. Upon taking back their government, Benito Juárez and the liberals continued to face internal revolts from within the country until his death in 1872. General Porfirio Diaz, seen as one of the heroes of the war, became an ever more prominent public figure. He would eventually go on to launch a revolution of his own to place himself as the president in 1876, serving as a dictator to the country for more than 35 years, the longest-serving president in Mexico's history. Formerly known as the Second French Intervention in Mexico, or sometimes referred to as the Second Franco Mexican War, was without a doubt a milestone in not only the history of Mexico, but to North American history as well. This war between the two countries would be the last time a European power would attempt an invasion of the North American continent. The Battle of Puebla would become immortalized through the creation of the holiday Cinco de Mayo, from the date in which the battle was won. Contrary to popular belief, Cinco de Mayo is not widely celebrated in Mexico, but rather in the United States. Although the holiday was prominently celebrated in Mexico throughout the late 1800s, this was mainly done as a way for Porfirio Diaz to glorify his own achievements. And when his dictatorship was overthrown in the 1910 Mexican Revolution, Cinco de Mayo faded away. However, in the state of Puebla, residents continued to gather annually in festivities and reenactments to, celebrate the time that they wrecked the French on the 5th of May. In the United States, Cinco de Mayo was celebrated by Mexican immigrants residing in the country as a way to honor national pride and their heritage. The holiday gained more popularity during the Chicano movement in the mid-1900s, and the holiday exploded in popularity in the 1970s and 80s through a series of popular marketing campaigns by beer and tequila companies. So, the next time you see your uncle slamming down a can of beer on Cinco de Mayo, you can tell them a little bit about the Battle of Puebla, and the tens of thousands of brave Mexican men, women, and children, and their insane battle to resist European colonialism.